Should you use your health savings account, an HSA, to pay for medical expenses, or should you save it for retirement? What does high-interest credit card debt have to do with deciding whether to use your HSA for medical expenses? And how do you make financial decisions when there is no clear course of action? We'll answer these questions and more on this, the 101st episode of the DoughRoller Podcast.
Welcome to the DoughRoller Podcast, where the best thing money can buy is financial freedom. We help you make more, spend less, and invest the rest. And now your host, Rob Berger.
Whether you're just starting out, buried under a mountain of debt, or well on your way to financial freedom, this is the podcast to help you take your finances to the next level. Hey, everybody, this podcast is sponsored by Betterment, the most preferred automated investing service. Betterment has cutting-edge technology to optimize returns, minimize taxes, and save you time and money. Join over 34,000 customers who have already streamlined their portfolio management at betterment.com/roller. That's betterment.com/ROLLER. Well, we've got hopefully a good show for you today. I hope you enjoy it. It's actually one that was motivated by a question from a listener named Mike. And as I was looking through my notes, what I try to do when I get email from everybody is kind of keep a running list of those emails that I think will make for a good show, and a good topic that others could benefit from. And that's what we've got today. And it turns out I've got a long, long list of them actually. And so I'm going to have more and more shows that are built around a question that you all have asked me, and I think that's terrific. Before I get to that, though, just a news item. It was interesting to me. In the Wall Street Journal, it was reported that investors are pouring money into Vanguard index funds. And it's pushing the mutual fund giant to almost $3 trillion. That's with a T. $3 trillion in assets under management, which is just phenomenal. Apparently, and I've mentioned this, but in the last Berkshire Hathaway newsletter that Warren Buffett wrote this past year for what would have been, that came out earlier in 2014 for the fiscal year of the company, 2013, he mentioned how he wanted the trustees to invest his wife's money when he passes away, and it was 90% S&P 500 index fund, 10% bond fund, and he recommended Vanguard fund. So apparently, the story goes that caused even more people to rush into Vanguard assets and put more money in there. And that has spawned a number of stories that suggest that the days of actively managing investments are over. And I kind of chuckle when I see that. I think that is, I just don't think that's true. And I actually think there is a place for active management, even though I'm a huge fan of index funds and they still make up a core of my portfolio. But it kind of reminds me of the days, leading up to 2008 when people said, you're crazy if you don't own a home. This was, when the home values seemed to be going up every other day, just, another 5%. It seemed crazy. And for those people that were renting, they felt left out, and they saw these other folks and families making a ton of money in real estate. And then, of course, the floor fell out from underneath us. And then you were crazy if you owned. It was amazing how quickly it turned. You were crazy if you didn't own. And then it was almost overnight, well, you're crazy if you do own. And, we seem to have these very myopic views of investing. We can't see beyond what's happening right at this moment. And it'll be interesting because I have, when the S&P 500 is up the way it's been over the last, 5 years? Index funds do extremely well. It's very hard to beat. How in the world do you beat an S&P 500 that, say, in 2013 was up 32%, including the reinvestment of dividends? That's tough to do. But when the S&P is not doing so well, active management can beat it more frequently. So we'll see how this turns out. I tend to, as big a fan as I am of index funds, sometimes I think we get too carried away. And I'll be curious to see how this plays out when the S&P is down 20 or 30% in a year, and that's going to happen, and it's coming. I don't know when, but the market can't go up and up and up year after year after year. It will revert to the mean. It always does. So we'll see. But I thought that was an interesting news item. Vanguard hitting that $3 trillion mark, unbelievable. So today's question comes from a reader named Mike. Let me read his question, and then we're going to kind of address this issue. I've got some more things to share with you, but let me read the question first. It has to do with health savings accounts, And so let me read that, and then we'll go from there. It's from Mike. He says, "Hey, Rob, I have a question about my HSA at work. I have about $14,000 in it. I have not used it at all in the past, as I have not had any significant medical expenses. This year, I have a medical expense of about $5,000. I have already paid the medical bills with non-HSA money. I would like to leave all of the money in my HSA year after year until I retire and use that money as a pseudo-retirement account. My question is, should I withdraw the $5,000 from my HSA this year to cover my medical expenses? If I pay for the medical expenses with HSA dollars, then I'm paying with pre-tax money and therefore saving on the cost of medical expenses. But then I lose the benefit of tax-free earnings over the next 15 years or so before I retire. Here are some details about me in case they are relevant in this decision. I am 47 years old. I am fully funding my 401k at work and have some taxable mutual fund investments through Vanguard. I have not invested in an IRA yet, but this is the first year I plan to do so. I'm single, and my income is about $150,000 a year. One other question. When I open up my IRA this year, should I open up a Roth IRA or a traditional IRA? Thanks for your podcasts. I really enjoy them. By listening to them, I feel like I am getting a degree in personal finance and investing for free. Mike. Well, first of all, Mike, appreciate the email and great questions. And let me just kind of hit one real quick, and that is the whole Roth IRA versus traditional IRA. I covered my thoughts on that in podcast 90. So if you go to DoughRoller.net/podcast 90, you'll get my views on that question. I generally don't think there is a right or wrong answer necessarily. I think sometimes, depending on your finances, the decision between a Roth and a traditional is easier to make. For a lot of us, frankly, it's not a particularly easy decision to make. The other thing I'd say is, remember, it's not one or the other. I mean, you could do a combination of both. You can't exceed the IRA limits, contribution limits, regardless of how many IRAs you have. But within those limits, you could put a half of the limit in a Roth and half of it in a traditional. I'm not saying that's the right answer, but I always kind of remind folks it's not an all or nothing question. But you'll get my views on that if you go to podcast 90. And on that, I should say, if I listed the how to find the show notes for every episode. That was podcast 90. This is podcast 101, so you'd go to DoughRoller.net/podcast 101. If you ever do that and it doesn't take you to the right page, you know what that means? That means I have forgotten to create that redirect so that those URLs will work. So if that ever happens, my apologies. It means I've had a brain fart and I've forgotten to create it, which, by the way, I did for the 100th episode. If you tried to go to podcast 100 after listening to the podcast in the first few days, it didn't work because I completely forgot to create the redirect link. It's in there now. But if that ever happens to you, shoot me an email, dr@doughroller.net, and say, Rob, you forgot again, and I'll get it working. I'm pretty sure podcast 90 works just fine. Okay, so here's how I want to attack Mike's question today. It's a great question. I mentioned that I'm preparing to take the Series 65 exam, which will allow me to become a registered investment advisor or set up a registered investment advising firm. The other thing I'm doing is taking the required course that I need to sit for the exam to become a certified financial planner. And I'll talk more about that and why I'm doing it and what impact it may have on you. But one of the things I want to do along the way is share with you some of the things that I'm learning and studying. And one of the things that I found interesting is this course that I have to take. It's a mandatory course that you have to take to sit for the CFP exam. And basically what you do is you create a comprehensive financial plan for a hypothetical family. And we're covering everything. How to get them out of debt, retirement plans, where they should save, their investments, asset allocation, risk management. We're looking at all of their insurance, just a ton of stuff. And on each of these issues, we're making recommendations. And here's the format that we're using. The first thing we do is we identify the issue. Seems straightforward. In this case, the issue might be, should Mike use his HSA funds to pay for medical expenses, or should he pay them out of pocket? But whatever the issue is, we identify the issue. We then make a recommendation. We then list the advantages of that recommendation. We list the disadvantages, and there are almost always disadvantages. And then finally, we list alternatives, because oftentimes, although a financial planner may give you a recommendation, that doesn't mean there aren't reasonable alternatives to consider. And that's the format we follow: issue, recommendation, advantages, disadvantages, and alternatives. And I kind of want to follow that that format in answering Mike's question, and frankly, in answering questions in the future, with one caveat, and that is I'll be very, very light on the recommendation. And there are a number of reasons for that. But one of them is, even given the detail of Mike's question, if I were acting as his financial planner, which I'm not, but if I were, and we're going to help him with this, I would need to know a lot more about his finances. And in the questions at the top of the show, one of the questions was, what does high interest credit card debt have to do with deciding how to whether to use your HSA for medical expenses? That might seem kind of crazy. What's one got to do with the other? But actually, they're very closely connected. You'll see that in a minute. Now, you might be saying, well, wait a minute. I don't know if Mike has high interest credit card debt or not. Right. I don't either. I don't know if he's trying to save for an education for someone in a 529 plan. There's a lot of questions I don't know. It's one of the reasons they call it comprehensive financial planning. The decisions you make in one area of your financial life can have an impact or limit your options in another area. They're all interrelated. And so I'll probably be light on recommending something. What I prefer to do is just to kind of walk through what are the factors you should consider, what are the advantages and disadvantages, depending on which way you decide to go. Are there any alternatives? But ultimately, the decision is up to you. So let's kind of walk through that with Mike's question on the HSA. And first of all, just a very quick sort of refresher. Health savings account is available for those with high deductible healthcare policies. And we covered HSAs in a previous podcast. That was podcast 67. So I'm not going to walk through all the details of an HSA. You can go to DoughRoller.net/podcast 67 if you want to get more details. But basically, you can set aside money. The idea is it's pre-tax. And if you use it for medical expenses, when you withdraw it for medical expenses, there's no tax on the withdrawal either. So you can imagine it's kind of a hybrid or a combination of traditional IRA and a Roth IRA. You don't pay taxes when you contribute, and if you use it for healthcare costs, you don't pay taxes when you withdraw it. So it's kind of a win-win, right? You get the best of both worlds. But the difference between, say, an HSA and what you might have used before as a flexible spending account is you don't have to use it all. It will carry over from year to year. And in fact, if you keep it in there and it keeps growing, when you hit 65 is the magic number, you can begin to take money out for non-medical reasons without a penalty. In that case, you will pay taxes, but you won't get penalized. And so because of that, a lot of folks use the HSA as an additional way to save for retirement. So that's the quick refresher on HSAs, and it kind of brings into focus Mike's question. Now, the second thing I want to do is, and this is kind of consistent with this whole idea of alternatives that I mentioned in the class on financial planning. What are some of his options here? And this may seem silly. It's like, well, one option is obviously to use the money that's in his HSA to pay his medical expenses. Right, that's the first option. What's the second option? Well, it seems obvious as well. He can keep the money in the HSA, and he can use after-tax money, just money, out of his paycheck, right? Right, he could do that. There is a third option. He can do a combination of both, right? Just like a Roth versus traditional IRA, this is not an all-or-nothing decision. He could decide to take whatever, let's say $2,500 out of his HSA, and use that, and pay the other $2,500 out of pocket. In other words, he has a combination, and that really gives him almost an infinite number of possibilities, right? And so I think it's important when you're confronting really any personal finance or investing decision is to sit down and think about your options. I suppose we could add a fourth option, right? Rather than using out-of-pocket money, he could borrow. He could put it on a credit card and pay it off over time. I'm not suggesting that's necessarily a good option or his best option. The point is there are options here. And so it's important as you're confronting these decisions, particularly where there's no one right, obvious answer for you stands out, to make sure you have a sense as to what your options are. And so, those are just some of the options. Maybe you'll think of others that someone in Mike's situation could take advantage of. But that's an important step in this process. And then the next thing I like to do is to consider some of the factors that he might want to think through. And this is particularly true if we assume he's going to use the HSA money. Let's just assume he's going to pay for the medical expenses out of his health savings account. Well, that's going to free up the $5,000 out of his pocket that he would have otherwise used, right, to pay the medical expenses. And that raises a question. Well, if he does that, what's he going to do with the $5,000? I think that's an important consideration in this scenario. So, there might be an infinite number of uses for that $5,000, but just based on his email and kind of thinking it through, what are some of the options? Well, he could invest in an IRA. He mentioned that he is going to, for the first time, fund an IRA this year. He could use the $5,000 to do that and maybe top it off to hit the contribution limit in 2014. But whether it's a traditional or Roth, whatever he decides there, or a combination of the two, he could use the $5,000 to fund an IRA. That's one option, right? What's another? Well, maybe he can max out an IRA regardless of whether he uses the HSA money or not. Maybe he doesn't need this $5,000 to max out the IRA. He can do that anyway. And in that case, well, he could take the $5,000 and invest it in a taxable account. He mentioned he has a taxable account at Vanguard. So in that scenario, maybe he just takes the $5,000. Again, we're assuming he uses the HSA money right now. So maybe he just takes the $5,000 he would have otherwise used for the medical expenses and adds it to his taxable account at Vanguard. That's another option. What's the third option? This gets us to credit card debt. Well, what if he has a lot of credit card debt at 15 or 20%? Again, I'm just making this up. He doesn't mention that in his email. I kind of suspect he doesn't. But if you're confronting this or a similar type of issue, maybe you've got some credit card debt. So one option would be to use the $5,000 to pay off that high interest debt. We can keep going. We could fund a 529 plan. I don't know if Mike has children or if he's saving maybe for a niece or nephew or someone else. But if he is saving for someone's education, he could use it to fund a 529 plan. That might be an option. A fifth option, maybe he's trying to work to build up his emergency fund, and he's not quite there yet. Maybe he set as a goal, say 6 months of expenses, a year of expenses, whatever his goal is. If he's not there, well, he could top off the emergency fund with the $5,000, perhaps put it in a high-interest savings account or a CD or wherever he keeps his emergency fund. That would be another option. The point is, in looking at this issue, I think it's important to say, if I use the HSA money to pay the medical expenses, what will I use the $5,000 for? Is there a higher and best use of that money, better than using the out-of-pocket $5,000 to pay for the medical expenses? And I think only if you have to kind of think through that before you can decide what's the best answer for you. There's not going to be a one right answer, right? Some people might have high interest debt, and it's better to use the HSA money for the medical expenses and attack that high interest debt with the $5,000 in out-of-pocket. That's going to be their best use of that money. Other folks, no, it'll be to fund a 529 plan or to top off the emergency fund or any other number of financial priorities that I haven't listed. And I think it's important to think through these issues that way so that you can come to what is the best answer for you. And if I were working as a financial planner for someone, that's what we'd be talking about. We'd be looking at their financial goals. We'd be looking at their financial priorities. We'd be looking at the reality of their finances, the good and maybe the not so good, to come up with what the best use of that $5,000 is. Now, beyond that, with an HSA, I would also be looking at his investment options. Some HSAs have some really good investment options. Frankly, some not so good. Now, if you're in a situation where your investments are not so good, maybe that suggests making a change if you can. But that's something else another factor I would look into in his case is how good are my investment options? Now, that's not a question he asked me. I don't know where he keeps his HSA, but I mention it as just another consideration. Now, oftentimes, as you work through these sort of financial realities that you're facing, what becomes clear, and maybe it's already clear in Mike's case, is what your goals are. So let's just think about two possible goals. Maybe one of his goals is to maximize his retirement savings. I kind of sensed that in reading his email. How can I maximize the amount of money that I can put away for retirement? That's my goal. Well, what's the answer to that? Well, he's already fully funding his 401k. Got that. Excellent. He's starting his IRA this year. So let's assume he can fully fund the IRA regardless of what he decides on the HSA. He can fully fund that IRA this year. Well, then for him, what might be the best option. Again, I'm making a lot of assumptions here. I don't know his particular circumstances beyond the email. But if he really wants to maximize retirement savings, then what might be his best option is to leave the HSA money in the account so that it can continue to grow and pay the $5,000 out of pocket. Now, you think about that. He's really setting aside a lot of money for retirement. Fully funding a 401k, that's $17,500. Fully funding an IRA, that's $5,500. He may be getting employer match on the 401k. I don't know. Let me just double check his email. I don't think he told me. No. And then he's setting aside the maximum on the HSA. So he's putting away, close to goodness. We're getting close to $30,000 a year in retirement. And if that's his primary goal, that's terrific. And if he's got the out-of-pocket money beyond all of that to still pay the medical expenses, for someone in that circumstance, it's certainly a reasonable option. And if maximizing retirement savings is his goal, that's the way to achieve it, right? Or one of the ways to achieve it. Perfectly reasonable choice. Now, let's take someone else in a different circumstance. I mentioned this, but you've got high-interest debt. Well, if you use your $5,000 out of pocket to pay the medical expenses and you leave your HSA money where it is, well, you're still then racking up high interest rate on, say, credit card debt, 15, 20%. If your goal is to get out of debt and to get out of this high interest debt, you may be better off using the HSA money and taking that $5,000 and taking a big whack at that high interest debt. Now, it's not your only option, right? There are always alternatives. Maybe you can get that high interest debt refinanced, whether it's refinanced to a 0% credit card. Maybe you would even take a 401k loan to pay off the high interest rate debt. It's an option. I know there is a lot of views that a 401k loan is really, really bad. There are absolutely advantages and disadvantages to it. You'd need to know a lot more information about circumstances before you'd make that choice. I'm simply saying it's an option. I published a post the other day about using Prosper or Lending Club. These are P2P, person-to-person lending companies that can maybe offer a lower rate on consolidation loan, particularly if you're at, say, 20% on credit cards. Maybe you get a much lower rate. My point is there are a lot of options here, but if you had high interest rate debt, one option would be to go ahead and use the HSA money for the medical expenses and use that $5,000 out of pocket to pay down on the high interest rate debt. The thing I'm trying to stress here is, even though this is a specific issue related to HSA money, the answer that's right for you or best for you, it could very easily depend on taking a look at your total financial picture. And what you do in one area affects another because it affects your cash flow, right? It affects how much cash you have available. The decision on the HSA money will decide whether you have an extra $5,000 or not to put towards another financial priority. And that's an important consideration when you're making any decision. So you can see there's sort of a lot to think through, but as you think through this, I think in most cases, the answer that's best for you will become clear. Now, as I mentioned, sort of in the financial planning framework, you always look at advantages and disadvantages of a decision. Now, in the case of the HSA question, I think they're pretty straightforward. So let's assume we're going to use the money that's in the HSA to pay for the medical expenses. What are the advantages of doing that? Well, it's tax-free. You put in the money pre-tax and you get to use it for medical expenses and not pay taxes. So it's a win-win. That's a big advantage. 2, you increase your available cash flow outside of the HSA. You got that $5,000 out of pocket that you don't have to now use to pay for the medical expenses. It's an advantage. You can put it to some other financial priority, and we've talked about a number of possibilities. In your case, there may be others, but you've got that added flexibility with your cash flow. A third potential advantage is maybe you've got better investment options with that $5,000 if you invest it outside of your HSA. Again, that's going to be very fact-specific, depending on where you have your health savings account and what your investment options are, but that is at least a potential advantage to consider. There may be other advantages, but those are the 3 that readily came to my mind. Now, what are the disadvantages? There's always disadvantages. If you use the HSA money what are the disadvantages of that? And I think the biggest one, particularly in Mike's case, based on what he said in his email, is, well, the money won't continue to grow tax-deferred and be there for him in that tax-deferred account when he retires. You'll obviously have spent it, and so it won't continue to grow tax-deferred. And I think for probably most people, that would be the big disadvantage of using the health savings account for your medical expenses. A lot of it's going to come down to your priorities. Some people use an HSA exactly for their medical expenses. They don't want it for retirement. They want it as a tax-advantaged way to pay for medical expenses. Certainly a perfectly reasonable approach. But others, it sounds like Mike, they want to use it to grow their retirement savings. And so if he uses the HSA money, well, that'll be $5,000 less that he doesn't have for retirement. And of course, he won't get the tax-deferred compounding on the money as compared to if he'd left it there. So I hope you found this helpful. It's kind of how I think it's interesting, because as I learned how financial planners should work through an issue, it's frankly kind of, I think, how I've been working through issues on finances for a very, very long time, and kind of how I've addressed, I think, many of the issues on this show over the last 100 and now 101 episodes. And I'll continue to use it because I think it's a very good way to think through financial decisions. Again, the real keys are, what are the advantages of the approach you plan to take? What are the disadvantages? And what are the alternatives? It really forces us, I think, if we do it right, to have an open mind. Sometimes I get married to an idea. I want to do something a certain way. And you got to be careful of that, because oftentimes you'll block out alternatives. You'll dismiss them out of hand. We have to get to a point of a decision, and then, I think that's important. But before we lock onto a decision, walk through the advantages, the disadvantages, and the alternatives. I think it can be a very healthy way to make decisions, particularly when there are two of you making the decisions, particularly when there are two of you with maybe different perspectives. Yes, that happens from time to time. And my wife can share with you plenty of stories when times when that's happened between the two of us. So walk through the advantages, disadvantages, and alternatives of a decision that you're about to make. I think it can help you make the best decision for you. So there you go. That was Mike's question. That was my sort of way of thinking through it. Of course, ultimately what's best for him, only Mike can say, and hopefully this helps him and helps you if you're working through a similar issue. Well, there you go. Hope you have a great day. And until next time, remember, the absolute best thing money can buy is financial freedom.